He watched her from the shadows, drenched and trembling as she ate scraps beneath the storm, and for 3 nights he returned to that same corner, unable to look away, unable to understand why his wolf clawed at his chest every time the rain touched her skin, why his hands shook with the need to shelter something he'd been taught to ignore, something his pack had already decided wasn't worth protecting. If you've ever felt invisible to the one person who should have seen you, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what you'd do if fate kept pulling you towards someone you were supposed to forget, because this story is about to break you in the most beautiful way. The rain fell harder on the 4th night, turning the alley into a river of forgotten things, and Kyle stood at the edge of the marketplace where the streetlights barely reached, his eyes fixed on the small figure huddled beneath a torn awning that did nothing to keep the cold out. She was eating again, the same stale bread she'd bartered for with whatever coins she'd scrounged from the day's labor, her fingers trembling as she brought each piece to her lips with a carefulness that made his chest ache in ways he didn't have words for. Her name was Iris, though he'd only learned it by listening to the market vendors shout at her to move along, to stop cluttering their storefronts with her presence, and every time they did, something inside him snarled with a violence that terrified him. He was the alpha of the Silvercrest pack, the youngest leader in 3 generations, a man who'd earned his position through blood and strategy and an iron will that never bent. But standing here in the rain watching this Omega girl eat her meager dinner alone, he felt like a boy who'd lost something he couldn't name. His beta, Marcus, had warned him about coming here, had told him that whatever pull he felt toward the girl was dangerous, a distraction the pack couldn't afford when the rival Shadowfang clan was already testing their borders, already whispering that Kale's leadership was too soft, too conflicted. Marcus didn't understand that the pull wasn't a choice, that every instinct Kale possessed screamed at him to cross that alley, to kneel in the rain beside her and offer her everything he had, even though she'd never looked at him, never knew he existed beyond the rumors of the ruthless Alpha who ruled the Northern Territories with a fist wrapped in midnight. She finished her bread and tucked the remaining piece into her pocket, probably saving it for tomorrow, and the simple act of survival in that gesture made something crack open inside him that he'd kept locked for years. He'd been raised to see Omegas as lesser, as necessary but not equal, as vessels for the pack's continuity, but never as partners, never as equals. And yet everything about Iris defied that teaching in ways that made him question every truth he'd been handed since birth. She stood slowly, her thin coat soaked through, and for a moment she lifted her face to the sky, letting the rain wash over her like she was accepting a punishment she believed she deserved, and Kyle's wolf surged forward so violently that he had to grip the wall beside him to keep from shifting right there in the street. The bond mark on his chest burned, the one that had appeared 3 months ago without warning, without ceremony, a silver crescent that his pack's healer had examined with trembling hands before declaring that the moon herself had chosen his mate, that somewhere in the world his Luna existed and the mark would guide him to her. He'd searched everywhere, had brought every eligible Omega in the territory to the pack house, had allowed the elders to parade potential matches before him like offerings, and none of them had made the mark so much as warm. None of them had made his wolf recognize anything beyond polite indifference. But standing here, watching Iris prepare to walk into the storm alone, the mark blazed like it was trying to burn through his skin, like it was screaming at him to stop being a coward and claim what was his. She started walking, her steps uneven on the slick cobblestones, and Kyle followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows where his presence wouldn't frighten her, where she wouldn't see the Alpha stalking her like prey, even though everything he felt was the opposite of predatory. She lived in a boarding house on the edge of the territory, a crumbling building that housed the pack's forgotten ones, the Omegas without families, the orphans, the ones who worked the lowest jobs and received the smallest portions and were expected to be grateful for even that. He watched her climb the stairs to a room on the 3rd floor, watched the light flicker on behind a window that was cracked and patched with tape, and he stood in the rain for another hour, just staring at that window, wondering what kind of leader he was that he'd allowed any member of his pack to live like this. What kind of man he'd become that he'd never questioned the hierarchy until it hurt someone he couldn't stop thinking about. The next morning he called a pack meeting, his voice echoing through the great hall where 300 wolves gathered in their human forms, their eyes on him with a mixture of respect and wariness, because Kale had always been unpredictable, had always ruled with a combination of fierce protection and brutal honesty that kept everyone slightly off balance. He announced new housing initiatives, new food distribution protocols, new rules about how Omegas would be treated within pack lands, and the elders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their aged faces creasing with disapproval that they barely bothered to hide. Elder Moira, the eldest of the council, stood slowly, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. She asked him what had inspired this sudden concern for the lower ranks, whether he'd forgotten that the pack's strength came from its hierarchy, from the natural order that had sustained them for centuries, and Kale met her gaze without flinching, told her that any order that required suffering to maintain wasn't natural at all, was just cruelty dressed up as tradition. Marcus pulled him aside after the meeting, his expression tight with worry, telling Kale that the elders were already talking about challenging his authority, that some of the older warriors were questioning whether an alpha who cared too much about the weak could defend them against real threats. Kale told him he didn't care, that if protecting his pack meant protecting all of it, not just the convenient parts, then they could challenge him and see how far they got. But that night, alone in his chambers, he pressed his palm against the burning mark on his chest and wondered if he was losing his mind, if the bond was driving him to destruction, if loving someone he'd never spoken to was the kind of weakness that would cost him everything he'd built. He dreamed of silver eyes and rain-soaked hair, of a voice he'd never heard saying his name like a prayer, and he woke gasping, his sheets twisted around him like chains, the mark throbbing with a need that went beyond physical, beyond rational. He started leaving things for her, small acts of care that he disguised as random fortune, a warm coat left on a bench where she'd sit during her break from the textile factory, a basket of food tucked beside her door with no note, no signature, just the silent promise that someone was watching, someone cared. She took them hesitantly at first, looking around like she expected a trap, like kindness was a language she'd forgotten how to read, and every time she wrapped that coat tighter around her shoulders or ate the food he'd left, Kale felt like he could breathe a little easier, like he was finally doing something right even if she never knew it was him. But the pack noticed, of course they noticed, because wolves were gossips and secrets in a pack spread faster than fire, and within a week the rumors started, whispers that the alpha had taken an interest in some nobody Omega, that he was letting his mark control him, that he was weak. The challenge came on the night of the full moon, when the pack gathered for the monthly hunt, and Elder Thane, Moira's son, and a warrior who'd wanted the alpha position for himself, stepped into the circle and declared his right to contest Kale's leadership. The old laws were clear, Thane's voice booming across the clearing, an alpha who couldn't control his own instincts, who let a bond mark dictate his decisions, was no alpha at all, was a danger to the pack's survival. Kyle accepted the challenge without hesitation, his wolf rising to the surface with a fury that had been building for weeks, and they shifted together under the moon's light, two massive wolves circling each other while the pack watched in tense silence. The fight was brutal and short, Kale's jaws finding Thane's throat in less than 5 minutes, holding there with enough pressure to make his point without killing, because he wasn't a murderer, wasn't the monster they wanted him to be. He released Thane and shifted back, standing naked and bloodied in the moonlight, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering as he told them that any wolf who questioned his right to care for his pack could step forward now, could challenge him now, or they could accept that strength without compassion was just violence with a crown. No one stepped forward, and Kale dressed slowly, his hands still shaking with adrenaline, his mark burning so hot he thought it might actually scar. He left the gathering without another word, his feet carrying him back to that same alley, that same corner where he'd first seen Iris, and she was there again, sitting on the steps of her boarding house with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. He approached slowly, no longer hiding, no longer pretending he had any control left, And when she looked up and saw him, really saw him for the first time, her eyes widened with recognition that had nothing to do with his reputation and everything to do with something deeper, something written in their bones. He asked her if she knew who he was, his voice rough from the fight, and she nodded slowly, told him everyone knew who he was, that the whole pack had been talking about the alpha who'd gone crazy over some girl he'd never even met. He sat beside her on those wet steps, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he told her the truth, told her about the mark, about the 3 months he'd spent searching, about the moment he'd seen her in the rain and felt his entire world reorganize itself around her existence. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers twisting in the fabric of the coat he'd left for her, the one she was wearing now, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, asking him why someone like him would want someone like her, why fate would be so cruel as to bind an alpha to an omega with nothing, no family, no status, no worth. He turned to face her fully, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that surprised them both, and he told her that she was wrong, that she had everything that mattered, that she had survived when the world tried to break her, that she had kindness when cruelty would have been easier, that she was his Luna whether the pack accepted it or not, whether she accepted it or not. Tears spilled down her face, hot against his palm, and she asked him what would happen to him if he chose her, if the pack would follow an alpha with a weak Luna, with a mate who couldn't even defend herself. He smiled then, fierce and certain, and told her that she wouldn't be weak for long, that the Luna's power was different from the alpha's, that once the bond was complete, once she accepted him and the mark on his chest found its mirror on hers, she'd be the most powerful wolf in the territory, because the Luna's strength was in unity, in protection, in the ability to hold a pack together when everything else tried to tear it apart. The courtship was strange and public, every moment scrutinized by wolves who wanted to see them fail, who wanted proof that an alpha couldn't love an omega without losing his edge. Kyle brought her to pack dinners, seated her beside him at the head table where Elder Moira glared daggers across the food, where warriors who'd sworn loyalty to him whispered behind their hands about the girl who didn't know which fork to use, who flinched every time someone spoke too loud. He taught her the pack's history in his private study, his voice gentle as he explained the bloodlines, the territories, the complicated web of alliances that kept them safe, and she listened with an intensity that humbled him, asked questions that no one else had thought to ask, saw connections between past and present that even he had missed. She was brilliant, he realized, had a mind that had been starved of education, of opportunity, and watching her bloom under his attention was like watching a flower grow in fast forward, like witnessing a miracle he didn't deserve. But the pack's acceptance was slow and grudging, and it was Iris who won them over in the end, not through power or displays of dominance, but through the same quiet persistence she'd used to survive all those years alone. She started working in the pack's nursery, caring for the young pups whose parents were on patrol or hunting, and the mothers who'd sneered at her began to soften when they saw how gently she handled their children, how she sang old lullabies that even the elders had forgotten, how she could soothe a crying infant with nothing but her presence. She organized the Omega housing repairs herself, rolling up her sleeves and working alongside the builders, her hands blistered and dirty, but her smile bright, and the warriors who doubted her began to respect the fact that their Luna wasn't afraid of hard work, wasn't above the pack, even if she was destined to lead it. Cale watched it all from a distance, his pride so fierce it felt like its own kind of pain, and he fell more in love with her every day, fell so hard that he forgot what life had felt like before her, forgot why he'd ever thought he could lead alone. The crisis came 6 months into their bond, when a messenger arrived from the Shadowfang clan with a formal declaration of war, claiming that Cale's reforms had made Silvercrest weak, that an alpha who elevated Omegas above warriors had broken the sacred laws, that they would take the territory by force and restore the natural order. The pack erupted into chaos, warriors demanding action, elders demanding Cale step down, younger wolves looking to Iris with accusation in their eyes, like this was all her fault, like loving her had doomed them all. Kale called for silence with a roar that shook the great hall's rafters, his alpha command washing over them in waves that forced submission, forced attention. And he told them that they would fight, that they would defend their home, but they would do it together. Every rank, every role, because a pack that only valued its warriors was a pack that had already lost. Iris stood beside him, her hand in his, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the fear he could scent on her skin, telling the pack that she would fight too, that she wouldn't hide while others bled for her right to exist, that if being Luna meant anything, it meant standing at the front, not cowering in the back. The battle was set for the dark moon, 3 weeks away, and Kale used every moment to prepare, training sessions that lasted until dawn, strategy meetings that went in circles, diplomatic attempts that failed because Shadowfang's alpha, a brute named Darius, wanted blood more than he wanted peace. Iris trained too, working with the pack's best fighters to learn basic defense, her body transforming from fragile to fierce as muscle replaced softness, as determination replaced doubt. Kale watched her spar with Marcus one afternoon, watched her get knocked down 7 times and get up 8, and he felt something shift in his chest, some final piece of the bond clicking into place, because this was his mate, this woman who refused to break no matter how hard the world pushed, this Luna who would lead their pack into war with her head high and her heart unafraid. The night before the battle, they completed the mating bond in the old way, under the full moon's light in the sacred grove where Alphas and Lunas had been joined for generations. The ritual was private, witnessed only by the moon herself, and when Kale marked Iris's neck with his teeth, when she marked his in return, the power that flooded through them was unlike anything he'd imagined. A connection so deep it felt like their souls had merged, like he could feel her heartbeat in his chest, her thoughts in his mind, her strength amplifying his own until they were no longer 2 separate wolves, but one unified force. The mark on his chest blazed silver and then faded to a soft glow, and when Iris looked down at her own chest, she gasped, because there it was, the Luna's mark, a silver moon cradled between stars, proof that fate had been right all along, that she was exactly where she belonged. The battle came with the sunrise, hundreds of Shadowfang wolves pouring across the border in a wave of fur and fangs and fury, and Silvercrest met them head-on with Kale and Iris at the front, 2 wolves moving in perfect synchronization, his black fur and her silver coat, a contrast that the enemy couldn't ignore. She fought like a storm made flesh, her Luna power manifesting as protective barriers that shielded the injured, as healing energy that kept their warriors standing when they should have fallen. And Kale fought with a ferocity amplified by the bond, every strike precise, every move calculated to end threats without wasting energy. They carved through Shadowfang's lines like destiny made solid, and when Kale finally faced Darius in single combat, when their wolves clashed in the center of the battlefield with both packs watching, it was Iris's voice in his mind that gave him the opening he needed, her Luna sight showing him the weakness in Darius's stance, the old injury that favored his left side. Kale struck true and Darius fell, his throat torn open, his challenge ended, and Shadowfang scattered like leaves in wind, their will to fight broken by their alpha's death. The victory celebration lasted 3 days, the pack house filled with music and food and laughter that hadn't existed in Kyle's territory for years. And through it all, Iris moved among their wolves like she'd been born to it, accepting congratulations with grace, checking on the wounded with genuine care, holding the pups who wanted to touch the Luna's mark and feel its warmth. Elder Moira approached her on the final night, her ancient face creased with something that might have been respect, might have been regret, and she told Iris that she'd been wrong, that a Luna who could fight beside her alpha while healing the pack was exactly what Silvercrest had needed, was exactly what the old stories had promised. Iris accepted the apology with quiet dignity, told Moira that traditions had value, but compassion had power, and maybe the pack could hold both without losing either. Kale found her later on the balcony of their chambers, staring out at the territory that was now truly theirs, her hand resting on her stomach in a gesture that made his breath catch, made his wolf howl with joy inside his chest. She turned to him with tears streaming down her face, happy tears this time, and told him that she was pregnant, that their heir was already growing inside her, that the pack would have a future built on the foundation they'd fought for together. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, gathered her into his arms like she was made of moonlight and promises, and told her that he'd watched her eating in the rain all those months ago and known, somewhere deep in his soul, that she was the missing piece, that everything before her had been practice for loving her right. She laughed against his chest, asked him if he was always this dramatic, and he told her only when it came to her, only when it came to the Luna who'd saved him from becoming the kind of alpha who ruled through fear instead of love. Years later, when their daughter played in the gardens with the other pack pups, when the reforms Kale had started had spread to neighboring territories, when other alphas came seeking advice on how to build packs that valued every member regardless of rank, Iris would stand beside him and remember that alley, that rain, that moment when she'd looked up and seen her future staring back at her with gold eyes full of impossible promise. She would remember thinking that she was nothing, that she didn't deserve to be seen, and she would marvel at how wrong she'd been, how fate had known all along that the girl eating scraps in the rain would become the Luna who changed everything, who proved that strength wasn't about dominance, but about the courage to love openly, to lead with empathy, to build something better than what you'd been given. And Kale would pull her close, his mark glowing in harmony with hers, and he would whisper thank you into her hair for being brave enough to let him love her, for teaching him that the greatest power an alpha could have was knowing when to kneel before the one who made him whole. If this story reminded you that sometimes the most powerful love stories start with someone simply seeing you when the rest of the world looks away, make sure you're subscribed to Alpha Reversed for more tales of redemption, recognition, and the bonds that rewrite destiny. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest, and check out the playlist for stories where fate refuses to let true mates stay apart, no matter what stands between them.